Alright, okay, we'll crack on. My name is Summer Turner and I am Head of English and Director of Teaching and Learning at a school in East London. And I'm going to be talking today about canon and character. Is there a place there for an academic curriculum in today's schools? So I want to start with where I began on the canon continuum. So if I think back to my PGCE, we were asked to do an activity in which we had to place ourselves along a continuum line as to what extent we thought the canon had a purpose in today's school. So whether we thought the canon should be part of the school curriculum. And I kind of firmly marked myself over to what I saw as the kind of liberal side of the continuum and argued quite strongly that the canon didn't really have much of a place in schools anymore and that it wasn't relevant and pupils wouldn't enjoy it and we should be thinking about expanding our idea of what good literature was. However, kind of 3 years on from that, I found myself in a school designing our English curriculum quite firmly based around the canon. A couple of years later, I'm now in charge of an academic curriculum, which is running throughout the school, and it's a strongly knowledge-based academic curriculum. So I'm kind of going to consider today how I kind of made that journey from one point to another, despite the fact my politics hasn't changed, but my view on how best to kind of make that work in terms of curriculum has changed quite a lot. And I think that it starts with what the purpose of education is about. So that's kind of central to any idea about what curriculum is. And there are kind of a few different ideas about what the purpose of education should be. I'm going to look at these kind of 4 main ones. So for its own sake, because it has an intrinsic value, for promoting social justice, for preparing children for the world of work, and to build character, to socialise children. And I think trying to decide, determine what it is that we think the purpose is, really kind of changes what type of curriculum you think you should teach. Now I think most people might say, well, it's maybe a bit of all of those things. You can't choose just one purpose of school education. But I think when it comes to curriculum, you have to choose a priority. You have to think about the fact you haven't got a huge amount of time or space, so you have to think about what is most important to you. What do you think you need to be getting out of pupils by the time they've left your care? And I think that this is something that's particularly complicated for English teachers. And I think it's particularly complicated because of the history of how English has come along. So it starts off with this idea that English is actually a relatively new subject in comparison to other subjects. So it's actually first taught, it's quite a kind of complex and awkward way that English literature was first introduced, in that it was introduced first of all in the 1800s in India as an attempt to kind of civilise the native population. So we've got this kind of awkward thing that they didn't want to use Christianity to do that because it's kind of morally unsound. So instead, how do we make people like English people? Right, well, we'll use English literature to do that. And then it was brought back to England, equally with the same kind of idea. Okay, so we study Greek and Latin as the most civilised, but for everyone else who hasn't studied Greek and Latin, what can we do to make them proper English people? Well, we'll study English literature. So it has a bit of a kind of strange and slightly awkward purpose at its kind of root. And it kind of developed a bit more than that, and we came on to kind of, the ideas of Matthew Arnold. So literature, it seeks to do away with classes, to make the best that's been thought in the world, and known in the world, current everywhere, to make all men live in an atmosphere of sweetness and light, where they may use ideas as it uses them itself freely, nourished and not bound by them. This is the social idea, and the men of culture are the true apostles of equality. The great men of culture are those who have had a passion for diffusing, for making prevail, from carrying from one end of society to another the best knowledge, the best ideas of their time. And I think this kind of idea is kind of at the root of English in terms of why English teachers are often quite torn in terms of what their purpose is. Because it's come from a history of thinking about English not just as the study of literature, but the idea of the moral kind of values of studying literature. And that's why it's slightly complex. And so you have this kind of idea of it being a civilising or socialising force. I don't necessarily think that when these people were first talking about it in that way, they meant it to be as elitist as it potentially now sounds, as now being critiqued. I think it actually links to this idea of social justice and moral character. And it's just perhaps how we've changed our own views on what exactly that might mean. So John Cherson Collins wrote a polemical book called The Study of English Literature, in which he insisted that education, especially university education, had new duties and responsibilities to instruct people of all classes. And for Collins, studying literature was a moral and aesthetic education, had a positive and healthy influence on taste, sentiment, opinion, and character. So right from the roots of English is getting this idea that English helps you develop a certain character. What that character exactly is not quite determined. And that takes us on to the emergence of the canon. So equally, in this Newbold report, which is this beginning of establishing English as a subject and discipline, argued that literature is not just a subject for academic study, but one of the chief temples of the human spirit in which all should worship. So even the language used to describe the study of English literature has this kind of moral quality to it, as a quality of religion, of worship, of morality. And so, again, even when we're talking about, so F.R. Leavis, who developed the English curriculum at Cambridge, not English curriculum at Cambridge, he was at Cambridge developing the curriculum for English schools. He saw kind of canonical texts as having lots of different purposes. They have intrinsic value in terms of art, but also for morality. And so again, we're building up this history of English teachers being interested not just in teaching literature for literature, but also thinking about what it tells us about our character, our morals. So it kind of explains to me why we're still having these arguments now, why English teachers are particularly the ones who've kind of been the ones to challenge academic education. So you've got someone like Michael Rosen, who has now argued that this is from a few days ago, as the exams get harder, more tied into the knowledge of the curriculum, the more people like Hirsch claim they're liberating people with a core curriculum, the harder young people are being hit by unemployment and lack of choice. Neat, huh? And I find that a kind of strange criticism, in that it's kind of trying to blame everything about society, or kind of people finding difficulties in society, on a curriculum that hasn't even come to its fruition yet. So the idea that it's to blame the core curriculum that doesn't actually exist is a kind of strange link there. But I think to be kind of fair to someone like Michael Rosen and to other critics of the academic education, it comes from the same background, right? So actually it's not that dissimilar to the kind of arguments when English is first a subject. It's all about thinking, what is the best way to improve the character of our children? How do we improve social justice? It's just that I think this is the wrong approach. The way that he's taking it is the wrong approach. But there's something interesting about the fact that English teachers have been at the forefront of kind of trying to work this subject out. And that was clear in the Newsom report. So in the Newsom report, the study of literature is seen as important, but even as early as 1963, they started to criticise this idea of traditional English teaching. So they said that most important, the overriding aim of English teaching must be the personal development and social competence of the pupil. So as early as 1963 is this focus on the idea that it should be about developing the character of the pupil rather than necessarily the aim being to teach the literature itself. And they said of the traditional, when handled with competence and conviction, the traditional teaching pattern can enlist interest and encourage progress, but it is too seldom about anything of much potential importance to the pupil. Where there is little to talk about, conversations or discussions cannot flourish. What is learned today tends to be forgotten tomorrow. It's not applied to other subjects. Nor, though plenty of work seems to be going on, do teacher or pupil seem to expect much real progress. There is little pleasure or respect for skill. And it also starts to make distinctions based on ability, which helps shape this idea of differentiated curriculum. The interesting thing about this report is that it's kind of, I feel like it's quite fairly balanced in terms of it's saying there is a kind of importance about studying literature, but it's its criticisms and this idea that you can't do that always through a traditional curriculum that actually starts to influence the rhetoric of English curriculum development after that. And I think that's linked to a few different things. That's linked to the kind of shifting society. So obviously the change in society, the kind of upheaval, the increase in equality for different groups, the kind of multicultural aspect of society made people quite rightly question whether what we were teaching was representative for everybody in their classes. And that was a good question to be asking. But what it kind of mistake it made was it went from thinking, okay, English at the moment says everyone has to be the same, to saying English has to be about everyone being different. And I think actually it's about English being something that everybody shares. And I think there's a difference between those three kind of categories. And a lot of that can come down to the side of interpretation. So again, you get these extremes. You get the kind of approach initially that there's a learned interpretation, this is what the text means. Then it kind of shifts completely the opposite way. So no, everybody brings their own personal interpretation, everybody's interpretation is valid. Well, yes and no. If you are just a starting pupil studying literature for the first time, there are some wrong answers. There are some things you can say about the text that are not going to be right. It doesn't mean it's not great that you're trying to handle it your way, but there are some things that you can be taught about, some ways you can interpret. Looking at literary theory and literary criticism is a way to kind of approach that. And the elitism argument. So this is something that is quite interesting, particularly because I think it often comes from people who have had quite a middle-class education themselves. So like, I can think of myself at the beginning of the PhD course kind of claiming like, oh yeah, the Canon's really elitist and terrible, coming from a very academic background myself, having had all the opportunity that a grammar school and a good university have given me. There's some sense in which it's a bit liberal do-gooder sometimes, I think, in that we feel like it is elitist to study all these things. Actually, is it elitist if we offer the opportunity to challenge these things? Then I think actually you've got the opposite effect. The same thing comes when it comes to this idea of the whole child. So in my first few days or weeks of blogging, I wrote a thing about the whole child and the kind of criticism of this focus on academic education and what about the whole child. Then rereading the blog, I realised that what I'd said was, yeah, it's terrible we focus on academic education, but I didn't actually mean that. The blog actually says exams, and when it says exams, it means the GCSE kind of A-level exams. The things that I said to do to develop the whole child were to talk about comparing Shakespeare and Sylvia Plath, and to look at current events and read newspaper articles together, and to criticise and engage with different pieces of literature. So actually, I was saying, use academic things in a way to enhance their engagement with text. I wasn't actually saying that it was elitist and wrong to study the Canon. But when you look at the argument, I think I thought at the time that I was saying academic education is wrong. And it's interesting how you kind of twist yourself in these loops of your own thinking. And that's something that I've developed a lot from my reading, from my engagement in things like Twitter. Interestingly, reading someone like Terry Eagleton as well, his critique of, this is his critique of Canon. He says, one of the traditional rationales for studying literature was, to put it crudely, that it made you a finer sort of person. This case suffered a severe setback when it was discovered that Nazi concentration camp commandants used to while away their leisure hours reading Goethe. Now I think there's a bit, Godwin's law here, right, bringing in the Nazis to try and undermine the argument. And it's a very extreme idea that because Nazi officers read great literature, that means that great literature therefore is somehow at fault, and that we shouldn't be kind of holding it up to be an important thing to study. And I'm not sure that this kind of extreme is that helpful. I also think it brings us back to this idea of English teachers and teachers in general kind of deciding what they think is good character. So how do we actually determine what good character means? We haven't actually agreed as a society really what good character means. And if we start saying that teachers have some responsibility to teach things that are only about kind of ensuring social justice and good character, we're making a judgment that teachers actually are able to do that, that they have enough kind of experience or knowledge or any right to define what they think good character is. And that's a real challenge, I think, when we're thinking about some of these things. So Frank Brady is really interesting on this because he's a firm believer in education's intrinsic value, and because he says it is the valuation of cultural accomplishments through which society renews itself and acquires the intellectual and moral resources necessary to understand itself and face the future. So interestingly, again, even though if you read Brady, he's quite critical of the politicisation and socialisation of education, the intrinsic value still links to this idea of developing people and developing character. It's just a different kind of version that we would see from the character education we get perhaps delivered from, for instance, the kind of government idea of character education. And this kind of picks up on the idea of why knowledge is important if we're trying to think about things like character, because otherwise we're left with quite empty rhetoric. If we're trying to think about what good character is and we're not basing it on anything, we're just saying, okay, let's study citizenship, let's just decide what makes good character and let's determine it and let's teach you the skills to be a good character. What's that based on? Where is that coming from? And I think you could end up being a bit like the kind of mob in Julius Caesar, being swayed by the rhetoric of the different speeches and actually deciding, okay, well, this Kerry Eagleton says actually we shouldn't read this book because that's going to encourage us to be like the Nazis. Actually, we should read this because it's more representative. It seems a bit more like you're being swayed by rhetoric rather than being swayed by any concrete understanding of how character and morals have developed over time. Freud is also quite convincing on the idea of authority. And I think this is really, really important when we're thinking about how we design curriculum and what content curriculum we have. So for instance, I put the hairdresser up there. I had this kind of really awkward encounter with the hairdresser last week in which I had this copy of this book in front of me as I sat down to have my hair done. And he said, oh, that's really interesting. I really hated school. Now, if he actually knew it was in the book, he wouldn't have been agreeing with that because the book would have been completely against his argument. But I said, okay, why did you hate school? And he said, oh, teachers didn't understand me, they didn't really support me, and it was really difficult. And then as he continued on, and I couldn't say anything because he had his hands in my hair and scissors, so I had to just be like, he told me basically about how he tormented teachers, how any time a teacher has taught him something that he thought was boring, it wasn't relevant, and that any time a teacher, he told some stories about teachers who'd obviously actually tried to take a different approach, and he then said they were patronising and they didn't understand him and they didn't know where he was coming from. So there was basically no right answer for him. And what it kind of confirmed to me was that in terms of our understanding and our respect for teachers as an academic authority, that seems to kind of have disappeared. And it's a lot more about teachers as kind of people who stand in a class and behaviour manage, or teachers who are supposed to make things engaging and enjoyable. And in a way, it's kind of strange to think secondary when you're told that you have to love your subject, you must have a passion for your subject. But you're always kind of told to make your subject smaller. You're always told to come up with activities to sell your subject, to kind of disguise your subject, rather than actually being told that, yeah, read things and go in and talk passionately about the things that you know about your subject. And I think that kind of undermines us as academic authorities and means that people lose their confidence in what they're teaching. And that means it's really difficult to design a curriculum. How do you design a curriculum and have any authority to say these are the texts we should study if you don't think, you've not been given any authority in the role of an academic? So you end up kind of looking elsewhere to work out, oh, tell me what I should be teaching, and then you can focus on the pedagogy rather than the content. And I think this is kind of particularly was evident to me when there was the kind of whole of mice and men debacle, because I've had a number of English teachers complain about mice and men over the years and say it's so annoying we have to teach this over and over and over again. And then as soon as it was announced that mice and men was no longer on the GCSE curriculum, there was some absolute uproar. How dare we not be able to teach of mice and men? Now, it didn't make much sense to me because not only can you still teach of mice and men, you just teach at a different time, but also one of the main criticisms of the English literature GCSE or literature is that it's too based around the canon, it's therefore too white and male and stale, or male and stale. And yet John Steinbeck is a white, dead, or male author. So it's interesting that that was a thing that suddenly everyone jumped on the bandwagon with. And when you looked at it, a lot of it was about, well, we've created all these resources, we've done loads of work preparing and teaching, we know this text. But it was quite sad to me that we shouldn't feel that we have the confidence to be able to teach other kinds of texts, and it not have to be that we've had to spend years preparing resources for one text. And I think that is about that lack of confidence in your own subject, which means that with the canon, we know in terms of the canon that that is a kind of the academic foundation as an English student. You know when you're studying something, even when I read contemporary fiction, I'm always able to see the references or bring it back to the texts that have come before. It's the foundation for that. Now, it doesn't mean that the new texts I'm reading, the contemporary texts, don't have any value, but I'm more able to determine the value of them based on my knowledge that's come before, based on the foundations of literature that's come before. I'm able to kind of have a better idea of what makes a good text. And I think we shy away from the idea that English teachers should know what a good text is. We're supposed to say, oh, well, whatever text you enjoy is a good text. And there's like an insecurity about us asserting our own confidence as an expert in the subject about what we think is good literature. Another problem for Frank Frady is that this idea of us questioning the shared set of values. So he argues about the idea of whether we should have kind of fashionable values. Now, I would disagree with Frady's opinion on this. So in fashionable values, he talks about any kind of more contemporary values, the idea of challenging racism and sexism, homophobia. And he says the problem, because we're constantly questioning what values we have, that's created an insecurity. And therefore, we shouldn't be focusing on those things in education. We should focus on teaching the texts, teaching our subject, and leave those other problems to a kind of society to deal with. Now, I agree in terms of the fact that I think everything gets lumped onto schools. So it's not actually, it shouldn't be schools' role to deal with everything, every ill that society has is not the responsibility of schools. However, where I differ is I do think there is a role in education where you can use it to challenge the status quo. But I think you can do that through a firm knowledge base. I think that's where it should come from. And it's, even with the canon, it's asking the questions of what is missing here? Who is not represented? That actually allows us to engage with how society has changed and developed. Where I think he's got a really strong point is this idea of authority and establishing our educational relationship with our pupils. So again, this comes back to this idea about an academic education is really cold and harsh. It means you don't care about the students, you don't care about their feelings, you don't care about them becoming good people, which I think is just taking it to a ridiculous extreme. In fact, some of the best conversations I've had with pupils have come from the fact that it's started at an academic standpoint. So from my previous school, I had this really, really troubled boy who had a very difficult home life and was really struggling in school. And I noticed during some literature lessons that he was really engaging with poetry. And so we had a conversation about poetry, and then I gave him a notebook and said, well, if you're feeling troubled over, you can go and write some poetry. And then he did start writing poems, and he used to bring me his collection of poems, and we would discuss the poetry. And that changed our relationship. It changed how he was in the English classroom, and in those moments, he was able to express himself, he was able to enjoy his classes. And it wasn't because I'd gone up to him and said, let's have a conversation about how you're feeling, or let's have a conversation about, because I couldn't identify with what he was going through. I hadn't been through that. It would have been patronising for me to try to claim that I could identify with it. Where we could build a relationship was through our shared academic knowledge and our shared interest in the subject itself. Equally, another student that I'm teaching at the moment, who suffers from autism, has also had some severe tragedy in his family life. And he has really come into his own. We've been studying war poetry, and he's been writing his own poems about how he feels. And he's also stood up and kind of lectured the class on how you respond to death and what that means and the impact of that, and related that to how people felt in the war. So that's without me doing anything. That's him coming from the stuff we're studying. It allows him to engage personally. So I think the idea that none of this stuff has got to do with caring about students is quite ridiculous. What I would agree with is Michael Young, who says actually the transformative part happens after the powerful knowledge. So it's all about thinking about your curriculum, starting with the knowledge and what happens as a consequence of that knowledge. And the idea that you have the knowledge and therefore you're told this, you believe it, and you keep the status quo is actually quite false. So it brings us kind of back to the canon, in the sense that the values of the text stand for themselves in the test of time, but they can also be questioned, but only when you know them. You have to know them to be able to question them, to be able to critique them. I found myself, I've come back from a background where when I was being in school, there was quite a lot of focus on kind of skills-based education. And I found myself when it got to university, I was really able to kind of argue any kind of point, but only up to a certain point, because I didn't actually have the knowledge to back it up. So quite expert at arguing it and kind of waffling through. But when it got to the point where anyone actually knew something, then I was kind of scuppered because I didn't actually have the knowledge to back me up. And I found that very frustrating. As an adult, I spent a lot of time trying to compensate for that. And it's very true that there's no point having the kind of ability to engage with arguments if you can only go to a certain extent, if you can't get involved in the debate fully, if you don't have the knowledge to back you up. And I think where Michael Young is strong on this is this idea of knowledge not as something that's about knowledge for the powerful or of the powerful, but powerful knowledge is a common entitlement that it should be something that we can all have and engage with, and as a basis for taking pupils beyond their experience. So instead of assuming that we have to kind of completely make everything about the experience that pupils bring with them, it's about saying, yes, this is what you've got, this is all of the other experiences, this is the wider world out there, this is other things you to engage and think with. And it's that challenges people to think beyond their own experiences and challenges them to think about what kind of person they want to be. So knowledge not as given, but fallible and always open to change through debates and research of particular specialist communities. And this point is interesting in that specialist communities, it's again placing this idea there's a value in being a specialist in your subject, that you have an actual expertise, and it's those people who should be communicating with each other about what should be the content of the curriculum. So I'm just going to look kind of quickly now at how all this has impacted on designing our English curriculum in high school. And these are some of the kind of questions that I, after kind of engaging this kind of work, what I kind of had to think about. So what was the purpose? That was initially, what did I think was the main purpose for the curriculum that we were going to teach? And for us, the main purpose is the intrinsic value of the literature, but I personally am also interested in this idea of challenging the status quo. So that was in my mind as I was designing it. Does character matter? Well, again, I think this comes back to this idea that we haven't really set on a firm idea of what good character is. And I think if anybody thinks they know what good character is, they're not thinking about it enough. I think it's a very complex thing. There are lots of things we can say. These we consider potentially shared values and shared virtues, but to absolutely determine what a good character is I think too complex to do. What I do think we should be doing is giving people enough knowledge that they can debate and engage with these ideas themselves. And so challenging the status quo was in my mind, and as well, what texts were worthy of studying. And then I had to think about things like media, film, drama, skills, where did all these things come in? So I kind of went to Twitter and I spoke to all these people here who gave me lots of different thoughts and advice and their own kind of experiences. And they all come from quite different backgrounds, so I did kind of go beyond the remit of just the kind of core knowledge crew and kind of thought about all the things that are out there. And this is kind of what came out of it. So we decided that we needed to focus on powerful knowledge, and powerful knowledge for us was whole texts. So we're strongly kind of in favour of studying whole texts. I think that's quite important to study English. I think the kind of engagement you get from actually completing entire text, the actual challenge of that is really great. And the text of the powerful knowledge is about this kind of chronology. So it's based around the idea you have to have the foundations and the chronology of literature in order to be able to engage with literature in the wider sense. So if you know literature from the start, we start with Beowulf in year 7, we build from there upwards, look through where has literature come from and therefore how does it develop. We don't go completely, it's not like year 7 Beowulf and then we only get to contemporary at the end of year 12, we do mix around, but we have this idea behind it that everything is based around this chronology. So where has that come from? And it's meant that pupils have actually started to be able to build on their understanding of where literature comes from. The same with genre. How does genre develop? How does it build? How does it change over time? And I wanted to put in there some wider questions. So this is where I guess the kind of more character aspect is addressed, but it's from a more kind of moral or philosophical route. And the questions, in Year 7 we look at how should we live, in Year 8 who is in charge, and in Year 9 what is truth. And those questions are our theme for the year, and so everything we study comes back to those questions. So whilst they are being taught some various facts, they're reading things, we're looking at the different interpretations, I'm also asking them all the time, well, what does this tell us? What is this? What are the messages coming out of here? What is it saying about the society of that time? How is that different or similar to society now? And it's based on this idea that we build and we revisit. So each part of the curriculum is divided into different sections. So we've got prose, poetry, Shakespearean drama, grammar and rhetoric. And it's built around these kind of two areas, so chronology and context, genres and forms. With this idea that we build, so we kind of worked out what they wanted to know by Year 11, how do we build there from Year 7. And so this is something that we constantly have to review, but it basically is centred around how can we work out what the chronology is and how the genres build and change over time. And it's something which students have engaged with really, really strongly, really, really well. The reason I know that is because we test them a lot. And again, apparently testing is terrible and because you hate children if you test them. I went to an interesting debate on this recently where there was a point, okay, if you're tested quite a lot, is that not a test of character itself? You don't have to be quite resilient to do lots of tests, the potential area of discussion. But it's another area for me where purpose is key. Yeah, I don't see the point in lots of endless testing if it has nothing to do with what you're studying. If the assessment is driven by the curriculum, then it's absolutely crucial. Right, so our assessment is basically checking, right, this stuff that we've been teaching you, do you know it? Otherwise, if we don't know if you know it, what's the point of me teaching you? I'm not actually working out how I can help you improve. And so the exam is kind of separated into different sections. We have short questions, short answer questions, we have multiple choice questions, and then we have more analytical. So by the end of the year, they have to do a test, which is, they do a test every half term. At the end of the year, they do an end of year exam, which is all the material from the whole year at the end of the year. So they have to have remembered everything they've studied from the beginning of the year at the end of the year. And they do a comparative question at the end of that. So this is the Year 7 one. Choose two texts from the following: Beowulf, Blake's Under Macbeth, and King of the Castle, and compare how the writers show how we should live. So this is the introduction that one of the students wrote. William Shakespeare, 1612, William Blake, 1757 to 1827, lived in two very different eras. However, their writings can help us answer the question, how should we live? Giving the reader a historical idea. In this essay, I will attempt to demonstrate how these two authors thought we should live. I shall show the ambition, politics, and moral choices of these two authors. Shakespeare uses antithesis, symbolism, and imagery in the following soliloquy to convey power, ambition, and good versus evil. So, not perfect, but there is an interesting engagement there with not only the texts themselves, but with what they're trying to say and what they're trying to develop. And that was first year, Year 7, and they're getting even better. So, finally, what is the pupil impact? Well, they're able to cross-reference. It's amazing to me now that in Year 9, they're able to refer back still to Year 7 work. They're able to make comparisons between different Shakespeare texts. We've done Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, Julius Caesar. They're able to, verbally and in writing, bring those references constantly. That's something that I wasn't able to do until university. They're able to understand cultural references and literary references from things like Animal Farm, and they often use them kind of to joke with each other. So we had two pupils who were kind of having a love-hate relationship, and then they started calling them Benedict and Beatrice and creating this whole thing around the playground about that. They also started to develop a really strong personal voice. I don't know if you can see that extract there, but she's starting to develop this really strong idea of what she thinks war poetry is about, whether or not it's connected to the idea of truth. Can we understand the truth of the war by looking at war poetry? So what's the difference between being a historian studying war poetry and being a literary critic studying war poetry? That's at the start of Year 9. So they embed references and they question everything. They are in a lot of lectures, we have people come in and talk to them, and they are not afraid at all to get into debates with people like who used to head up the BBC and with great famous scientists. They're able to listen to them for 2 hours and then question them quite rigorously about what they've been told. So they're not just receiving things and then just assuming that's right and then going on. They're receiving things, thinking about them themselves and challenging them. And they, as a result, have got strength in debate. So their debate is based on informed debate, rather than just the appearance of being able to question and argue. And for me, that's shown actually how important kind of the knowledge base is, why an academic education is still central to what we do, and how we can do those different things. We can, as English teachers, still engage with our kind of maybe liberal do-gooder selves that wants there to be this challenging of status quo, wants to be a bit of an anarchist or a rebel. But we can do that still by teaching them the foundations of where we've come from, and then teaching them how you think about that and work on the challenges yourself. So that is it. Thank you.